This is the Stine Seedcast. I'm your host, David Thompson. Join me as we visit with growers, agronomists, seed experts, and other industry professionals about seed, agronomy, and the business of farming. Hello, and welcome to the Stine Seedcast. I'm David Thompson, National Marketing and Sales Director for Stine Seed Company. Every March, Stine honors and celebrates the many contributions made by women in agriculture. And on today's special episode, we're excited to introduce a woman with a storied background in the ag industry, Colleen Krantz, owner and founder of Pink Spear Productions and contributor to Market, which airs on public television stations across the U.S. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So today we're going to dive into Colleen's background as an ag storyteller, including her diverse career in media and the women who have inspired her along the way. So let's get started. Well, so Colleen, thanks for joining us today. Like I always like to do on the podcast, I guess if you would give us a little bit of a level set, talk about your background, where you're from, and kind of a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I grew up in Guthrie Center in west central Iowa. My parents had or have cattle, cow-calf operation, and all of us were involved as kids on helping on the farm. And when I graduated, I knew I was interested in journalism. Thought about ag journalism, but I was looking at Iowa State, and they had just sort of placed that back under general journalism. And so I did stick with journalism and ended up working sort of in news reporting in metro areas around the country at newspapers, first St. Louis, and then a couple of years in Milwaukee, and then came back to my home state and worked in Des Moines before stepping away from newspapers to do other kinds of journalism, a book first, and then I discovered, to my surprise, that I also like doing television and film, which is something I hadn't really thought I would head for eventually. I liked writing and thought it would feel different writing for those mediums, but I've loved all of these, so... And now I live in Adel, and I still help with marketing at my parents' ranch, which is Bradsey Ranch. And my husband and kids are all sort of stayed interested in agriculture, whether it's through 4-H or my husband works in ag business. And so, yeah, that's how I got here.
Yeah, so it's amazing. Like you said, you've had a deep background in journalism and in storytelling in general, with not only newspaper writing, magazine writing, filmmaking, documentary production, all of these different things. I guess I'm curious what kind of led you into that. You talked about kind of finding that drive at an early age, I guess. What led you down that path?
I think it's curiosity. So I've always been interested in other people and their stories in a way that I kind of see them as people are full of things you'll never have time to learn or experience, or they've seen places I won't have time to see in my lifetime. And so I've always find other people fascinating. And so naturally, journalism is a great fit for that, because I get to spend my days going out and talking to all kinds of people. And that changes through my career, what the focus might be. Starting out early, it might have been more likely to be covering crime or courts, and today's more agriculture and everything in between. It's just been fascinating.
So I think we'll probably spend the bulk of our time today talking about your experience in agriculture more currently. But I guess before we get off of your background, you talked about some of your experience both in book writing and documentary writing. Is there anything you want to share with us about, projects you've done?
I think I tend to be drawn when I switch to documentary and with my book, I tend to be drawn to some of today's harder topics, more controversial. And I think that's because I like the idea of sort of diffusing tension when I can. So my first one was a crime documentary, sort of, but it really was about immigration through that crime story. And I wrote it in a way where it's journalism. So you're researching all this background and information, but I'm really careful to try to present it so anyone from any point of view can come sit down and watch it. And first of all, not feel like they're having an opinion shoved down their throat, but also that they can turn to the person next to them who they came in and knew didn't agree with them on the topic and maybe actually have a productive conversation. So I found, that was one topic. The next one looked at how society reacted to unplanned pregnancies a century ago. I guess that was my third one. And, I sort of have continued that idea of like trying to draw people together through giving them room to think and not feeling like they're forced to try to fit your point of view.
So, like you said, from an early age, storytelling was a passion of yours. How did agricultural storytelling become a part of your repertoire?
I think it was just because it was always such a part of my life. Growing up on a cattle ranch, I loved that childhood, and so I've always tried to stay involved somewhat. It's honestly, I think helping on the ranch helps me stay creative too. It sort of gives me a sort of time to unwind, which sounds funny to people that have to do it every day, but when it's an option and I can go a couple days a week, it's great for turning on the creative juices, I think. So that's, and that just sort of, led to, as I sort of had gone through other kinds of journalism and reported on other topics, I was ready to re-enter the ag world, partly because I started looking at how some media was covering agriculture and really feeling disenchanted about it. There's a lot of misunderstandings that sadly the media carries forward. And as a journalist, it's really disappointing. And at some point I finally realized instead of complaining, I should try to do better journalism in this arena. It was also probably brought forth a little by the fact that I had a documentary that Iowa PBS, which is the home to market, had aired, and they knew my work then and invited me to apply for a contract job that was related to agriculture, which then spun into me applying later for a part-time opening. And I protect the other part of my time for my own independent work because I love being able to pursue my own ideas and topics, but still get that sort of regular, good, solid journalism that we do at Market to Market.
So at this point, you're a published author, you're a documentary filmmaker, contributor to a national weekly ag program. I mean, there's a lot going on there.
My joke is short attention span. I don't know. I think that's the beauty of today's world, which maybe we'll get into a little bit. But I don't think that the core of journalism has to change as the platforms change. You're still trying to. You should be still trying to do a really nice delivery of even-handed delivery of facts and information and sort of being a watchdog for government. There's all these roles that shouldn't change through the platforms. And I always look at something that catches my attention and I ask, what's the best platform for this and what fits in best here? And in some cases, this is the biggest departure for me is that I've lately been thinking about, not lately, but I've been working on my first fictional project, which I'd never planned to step away from nonfiction. It's a series called Complete Bull, which we were able to win a grant to shoot the first episode. And that's really I should say, one of the strongest as far as how passionate I am about the story that needs to be told. I think people need to be able to walk a mile in the shoes of somebody on a farm. And in this case, the lead is a woman who is going to be the lead character in an agricultural story, which I think we need more of that too.
And I like your comment because journalism, is about probably not so much telling you what to think, but more telling you what to think about.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yes. Yeah. And I will say I get why people want to start watching news platforms that are partisan, but my joke is it's like the drug that's bad for you. Yes, it's not going to be good for any of us in the long run. If you get addicted to the one-sided delivery of news, we just become more and more. You stop seeing the other points of view at all. And I get why that's tempting, but I just think it's so important, to, especially with the political divide we have going on, to not let yourself fall into that temptation.
So we talked about your early career probably being less ag-focused, but certainly the bulk of your career being in ag. And I guess I'm curious, as a woman in ag, are there any unique challenges to that as a journalist relative to the alternative, right?
I honestly feel like in the Midwest, at least, I feel as a woman that I've gotten a fair shake. Journalism in my time period has evened out pretty nicely. I think there's more women probably in journalism now, or at least it's close to even. And I feel like in the agricultural world, even if I'm helping at the ranch or interacting in that world, I feel the same way that like men are respectful and treat me as an equal. And my joke is the only exception might be when you're dealing in mechanical situations. I have a sister who has she's a cattle, she has her own cattle place in Nebraska with her husband, and she tells me the story of going to the mechanic once with their feed wagon, and she comes back later to find out what was wrong with it, and the mechanic said, "Well, don't you want me to just call your husband and tell him?" No, I can think too. I honestly think, though, in general, that's rare that women deal with situations like that. And And I think the more women we have sort of acknowledging whether maybe we're already doing quite a bit in agriculture and stepping into it more, it'll get better and better.
Yeah, and certainly if you look at enrollment in a lot of the land-grant universities, I mean, representation is strong across a lot of the aspects of ag.
Yeah, especially if I think vet med is tremendously shifted in 10 years or something. It went from, I think it's 3/4 are women or more now, or something like that.
So are there stories in your mind right now, current events with women in ag that you think are especially important?
I do want to talk about one thing. It's not exactly a story as much as sort of a point of view. I do think sometimes parents still tend to think of their sons first when they encourage thinking about a future in agriculture. It's going away, but I was interviewing somebody for a story one time, and wonderful farmer and smart man, but at the end of the interview he said, his 3 kids were playing in the yard around us, and he said, I'm doing all this for him. And he pointed right over the head of his 6-year-old daughter to point to his 4-year-old son. And his 2-year-old daughter was playing in the background. And I think just where agriculture is going, if you want to encourage your kids, just point at all of them and say, I'd like any of them to have the chance if this is their passion. And I think we have to break those habits of sending messages to little girls that this is not for you as much as it is for your brother or something. And teach the girls the same things, if they're not interested, that's a different story, but at least get them the basic exposure that and hopefully it'd be the same for sons so that they know if it's something that fits them or not.
Yeah, that's great. That's great ideas. Succession is challenging enough without, excluding certain people just for various reasons. But,
yes.
As you look back over at least your time, and you have a unique perspective because you, again, grew up in a farm environment and then now, work in the field of ag. But I guess I'm curious, over your time, how has the role of women in ag evolved just during the time that you've seen?
I think women are probably speaking up and being more willing to acknowledge the role that they've had. And some of that goes way back, but maybe our mom's generation didn't always want to take credit for being farmers, even if they really were, because they saw themselves as, what was the term, housewives, which is funny thinking about it. But they really were a lot of times doing a tremendous amount on the farm or with the farm business. And I think we should encourage, even if a husband is the primary farmer, for example, encourage those who are part of that to not feel like they can't step up and speak as people of agriculture too. And I think that's improved. And I hope we start having more and more women who feel comfortable being the lead producer or grower or rancher and farmer, making sure they're fully educated in all the right areas too, even if they maybe weren't introduced as well as a kid or something.
So are there any particular women in the field of agriculture that you look back and say that they've been an inspiration to you?
I probably have to look at my family just because that's where my first influence comes from. My mom is a extremely hard worker and very humble and a great role model of sort of just that doing what needs to be done and going about it cheerfully, I guess, if that's a good way to put it. And then my little sister, who I mentioned, Erin is a rancher or cattle producer in Nebraska. She started a heifer development lot. So she sort of has a little bit of a niche in the market, and that's her own thing. Her husband's also been long involved in cattle and crops, but this is sort of her baby that she started, and really, took the time to look for a different approach or a different market to capture. And I also like that she went and sought the advice of an older woman who had done one of these in, I think, southern Nebraska, and was retiring, and said, "Hey, tell me what you know." And they got along great. And my sister was doing it looking for advice and the wisdom of somebody who'd been through it. But in the end, the older woman that had sort of taught her a lot of this, I think, referred customers to her. And I really admire that she not only had the courage to go out and try something different, but also had the wisdom to sort of look for those with the wisdom who did it before her, and not assume you have all the answers right away. So,
get the knowledge transfer, and absolutely get you a good foundation. So switching gears a little bit, talking about, as I said, you're a contributor on public television's Market to Market program. You've covered a lot of different ag stories in your time. Any ideas on stories particularly that stand out to you?
I find that I tend to be drawn to science-related ag stories. So if we look at our point in time in agriculture, you can't help but look at the tremendous amount of progress that comes with genetic editing and progress in terms of feeding the world and solving diseases and so on. Of course, it's important to find the right careful balance with how fast we move with those and analyze those. But I think that's a very important story, and I find myself covering a lot of topics, whether it's PRRS and hogs or being careful about holding protein in soybeans. Or I was just in Florida a month or so ago covering, there's a disease called citrus greening, which a lot of us don't even know about, even though it did. It wiped out 90% of citrus production in Florida over, I think, a 15-year period, which is shocking to think about. Imagine, the Midwest losing 90% of its corn or soybeans and it being unsolvable, which it has been so far. And it was basically a combination of a bacteria and a invasive insect that together made this disease spread and, wipe out the trees all over Florida. And I went back. I'd gone there once before to when it was first starting to report it, and now I went back to look at it doesn't involve any foreign DNA, but there's a company that bought the technology from University of Florida, and they think they have a genetically edited tree that might finally solve the problem. And, those are the kinds of things that are sort of historic. They changed the game historically, and think about the potato famine and how there was no answer there either. And this one took a long time, so it's unfortunate that it'll be another 5 or 6 years if they do solve it. And by then, who knows what's left of citrus at all in Florida, but it could save citrus in Texas and California. And so I guess those are the kind of stories I try to think about, like in a historical perspective, what's really important right now.
Well, and it's interesting because those stories even have impact outside of, I remember just in the last few years hearing about that disease. And the reason was because in northern portion of Florida, they were just tearing out groves like crazy, planting corn.
Yes.
So all of a sudden the corn market is now being impacted by, this disease that is affecting the orange crop, right?
Yeah.
So, there's only so many acres around, but it's interesting how those things affect each other in those profound ways, right?
Like I remember being in Texas for a story that was related to cotton, and ultimately that's what happened there. I can't remember exactly what the trigger was then, if it was weather or honestly, they also had some really big resistant weed problems, and they don't have as many options there for cotton. And so it was hand weeding, and a lot of people were switching to corn. So same point, it's although what's happening in other areas affects the Midwest and the Corn Belt and the market prices. So
and how they respond to those probably also needs to be watched for. There's seems to be no shortage of diseases and pests and problems. Even in the corn and soybean business, we've seen things like tar spot arrive on the scene almost overnight, relatively speaking, in terms of time, or like red crown rot in soybeans, things that you just didn't hear about. And so anytime these things come up in any crop, we need to study how that came about, what were the warning signs, and what's the lesson for us, right, in the crop that we're working in? Because what goes around, it'll eventually come around and it'll get to us. So.
Yes, I respect your scientists because it's like a constant battle, right? You find one thing, solve one thing, then there's something else waiting, what's next?
Exactly. So we talked about that in terms of concepts of stories. I guess while I'm at it, I thought you've probably had the opportunity to interview a lot of different people. Are there any particular interview subjects that stand out from your time?
I don't tend to be someone it's funny because I'm probably more interested in sort of the average Joe stories than celebrities. So funnily, celebrities sort of slip out of my mind quickly of who I've interviewed, but I remember people, and I can't think of her name, but I probably 8 years ago interviewed a woman who had been a rancher in her own right. She was probably in her 80s and she was still ranching in Texas. But she, as a young woman, she'd stepped in at that point and was ranching on her own, which was a very rare then, and she was just such a super interesting interview, I thought. And I feel bad I can't think of her name, but it's been too long. But those are the kind of stories I really enjoy. Someone like her who had the courage to, she would walk into a seed store or something in Texas, and she could hear at that time, the men weren't maybe so gracious, and she would hear men grumbling about what's she doing here? What's she doing in those clothes? And it took courage to do those kind of things. And those are the type of people I find interesting to interview.
So I guess, what's a story that you have covered during your time in ag that has maybe changed the way you think about agriculture in general?
One that comes to mind is I briefly mentioned and this is a little nuanced, but it deals with the tiny, tiny slip in protein percentage in the U.S. in soybeans. And it seems like such a minor thing. But this story, I talked to a lot of experts, and they talk about how that resonates into when you're going to Europe and you're looking for exports, buyers in those export markets, especially with soy meal, they're feeding animals and they don't want that protein to slip at all. And so all of a sudden somebody else's protein has 0.5% more. And so that's where we want to buy from. And it's a funny thing for a company selling seed, because your customers are going to be asking for yield. And that's all they're going to care to pay for. And it's really hard, I think, as a company. And this kind of applies in livestock, too, in a lot of ways. You can chase one sort of trait and lose in another. And I think that's what scientists have been telling me, too. If you push too hard in one, something else is going to fall back. So I think it's important that customers try to think that way. My dad would say if you push cattle too hard on growth, you might lose on, the milk on the maternal side, or, there's a give and take, and it's, you might find a few exceptions with certain seeds or certain cattle, but it's rare. And I think that kind of story just made me think about that. Like when it comes to the science of agriculture, there's always seems to be a give and take. And sometimes when you're buying the products, you have to think about, even if it doesn't help you when you go to the elevator, to have more protein, it might help you as an industry, which still can change your pay. But it's really hard to think that way. And I just found that as a fascinating dilemma.
Well, and on our end, we talk a lot about genetics is very fluid. You can kind of push it any direction, but you can't really push it every direction at the same time, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
There is always an ebb and a flow to how that works.
Yes.
So back to talk about, again, you're a journalist by trade, so we live in a different age, of journalism, in different forms being everywhere. How do you see journalism as it fits in the digital world today? How has it evolved? How is it evolving?
I don't think all the changes have been good, but I think the thing to remember, and we as journalists need to remember this, that the core things can stay the same through different platforms or social media. We have to remember those core values of being careful about our research, even when you're in a hurry and when you're trying to be the first one out with something, double checking and being even-handed to try to genuinely understand others and be aware of your bias and try to set it aside. But I also don't think I'm not one of those that moans and groans about the changing world. There's a lot of good things that come with some of the negative. There's new voices we can hear in agriculture. That's been a great thing, I think, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about agriculture. And as we have some more people stepping forward on social media platforms or traditional platforms and giving you a chance to look inside their daily lives, I think that's all a positive thing. I think there's some negative, but I think we have to keep in mind the positive that comes out of the changing world. Probably the trickiest part is attention spans. It's not good, It's there's a discussion and sort of on the fictional side of TV that I'm entering now, but do we adjust shows for short attention spans, which I think is heartbreaking. I don't know that that's happening yet, but there's a lot of talk about changing a storyline that might work really nicely, but if somebody might look away at their phone and you lose them for a second, it's kind of sad to me that we have to think that, but it's correct that we have to think that way a little bit because it is hard to grab attention spans in a sort of chaotic world of media coming at you. The good thing about agriculture is I feel like it's easier to find your people, sort of like and I don't mean politically one-sided, as I've talked about that already, but I mean in terms of your subject area, finding the audience that's really interested in your topic and building loyalty. Market to Market's had a long tradition of really loyal viewership, and I think, honestly, that's the kind of thing that Netflix even now and companies like that are starting to realize is if there's one show that people will come to our platform for, what is it? Even if it doesn't have the total highest number of viewers, they want the most loyalty-driven, like what makes you subscribe. And I think loyalty is going to be as important or more than numbers ultimately. And agriculture's got that really natural way to find each other, sort of.
Yeah. It's ag is a small world.
Yeah.
One way or the other it is.
Yeah.
And to your point, market to market's been, I just read 50 years
Yeah.
in the industry. So that's a pretty impressive run for a weekly program like that. So looking at the future, we talked about the changing digital landscape. And so you've got a group of young people coming out of college now. And so I'm curious, as you think about women coming out of school into the field of journalism, what would you tell them who are looking to pursue a career in this new environment?
I do think you have to be careful to understand if you're doing journalism or if you're doing some other kind of communications. And this is where the line gets blurred. And if you're doing journalism, then that's where it is your job to know your bias. Even if it's a pro-ag bias, you have to be aware of that and balance for it. You have to go find the voices that might be critical and hear those also, because that's what we want to do, is hear all voices and be fair in presenting topics so we have sort of smart decisions in the end. If you're not doing journalism, make sure people understand it's commentary, and if you're giving opinions, and that's not wrong. I think it's just important to be clear on what you're delivering, so that, because it's not. Not every consumer understands that. Most do, and they can separate news from commentary, but it's a confusing line for a lot of people, and I think it's dangerous too for trying to be a sort of an informed society.
That's an interesting point. Nowadays, in this day and age, we receive our news and our commentary from the same spigot.
Yes. Yes.
So that makes it difficult to discern one from the other.
Yes.
A little bit of research goes a long way.
Yes, and even sometimes when whoever's delivering it to might put their commentary on it, which I guess that's how the water cooler always worked, though, too.
Sure. Yeah. But you knew you were at the water cooler. You knew you weren't watching the news or whatever. And
True.
So a little bit of separation of church and state in a way.
Yeah.
So you talked about, again, kind of your latest foray into episodic television, I guess. Is there a story or an idea or something in ag that you haven't done yet that you're really, really interested in?
On the journalism side, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. The market-to-market executive producer is Dave Miller, and I've talked to him about this, and we haven't gone very far, but I'd really like to work on a rural refugee story. And I didn't think there's a lot of, it's pretty straightforward. I want to just tell the stories of some refugees that ended up in rural areas, partly because I understand now that through the U.S. refugee program that rural areas really don't get refugees anymore if they don't have mass transportation. And I think that's kind of a sad loss, now you think about in the Midwest or South or wherever, there's how many towns and cities that are smaller don't have public transportation.
Yeah.
And they're now no longer able to help, even if they'd like to. I think, from what I understand, unless that rule has changed, that was only a year or so ago. And I honestly think it'd be interesting to hear from those who came, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, what their experience was like coming to a rural area. Was it positive or negative, or how did that impact them versus going to a city? And that's kind of one of the things I have on my radar for down the road.
So sort of a generational divide there of a group of folks who probably made it out into rural parts of our country, but that doesn't happen anymore, is what you're saying.
Yeah, essentially, unless they find their own way there later once they've sort of established themselves with a job and so on. But it'd be a while, and they probably have roots set then. And so you miss that. You also miss that sort of global interaction that can help happen naturally when someone lives in your town. I feel like it takes away an opportunity in a sense. There's a woman who works at Iowa PBS she's extremely entertaining, and she came from Eritrea, which is most people know is next to Ethiopia in Africa. And I forgot how long ago she came, but it's a fascinating story of, escaping war essentially in that region and crossing the desert in Ethiopia to reach a refugee camp. And she was flown to the U.S. and tells the best story about, in her mind, she was going to be coming into somewhere like New York City. And so they flew into North Dakota. And she said, I told them, this is not the U.S., go back. You came the wrong place. And also just the funny story that she had walked, I think it was sandals that she had worn across the desert, and they were special to her. They'd made this journey with her, and the North Dakotans kept telling her about winter. They were trying to explain snow. You can't wear those. She just refused to believe until she had to experience for herself why that was a bad idea. But I think those stories are just tiny little things in our daily lives. But like having somebody come from another part of the world to your small town is such an important thing. And I feel like that's been taken a little bit, not entirely, but through the refugee program anyway.
Well, and those interactions lend perspective, right?
Yes.
To your own life experience, that there's a lot of different things all over the world, and it's good for you to be exposed to those things.
Yes, exactly.
Those. Yeah.
You can take things for granted, right?
Exactly. As we're kind of wrapping up our conversation here, Colleen, again, you have your own production company, and so between your own projects and the projects you do with Market to Market, I guess, where can listeners go if they want to learn more about your work and the things that you've been working on?
My independent work is under my production company, which is called Pink, like the color, and Spear, like you throw. So pinkspear.com has all my independent films linked there. And then for Market to Market, markettomarket.org is an easy way to get there. And we're broadcast in, I think, 17 states also, but the stories can be found on the website also.
Awesome. Well, Colleen, it's been a great conversation. Enjoyed having you on the podcast today and talking about your experience as a woman in ag and your history and experience here and your unique journey. We appreciate everything you do to share the stories of agriculture with everyone, and wish you continued success. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Stine Seedcast. To never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. Have a question for our experts? Email asktheseedcast@stineseed.com to have your questions answered on a future episode. To learn more about Stine Seed Company, visit stineseed.com. And remember, Stine has yield.